wonderful to see all of you here and on this launch of Pune Public Policy Festival. So I join Indranil and Sanika also in welcoming you, and it's great to see in such packed audience. This just to for those of you who don't know, on my left is the portrait of Mr. Kale, who was the benefactor who gave a donation long ago in 1930 to found this institute called Gokhale Institute, which is probably one of the oldest institutes focused on economics and allied subjects and a deemed university since 1990. And on my right here is the portrait of Dr. D.R. Garge, who was the founding director of the institute. He was a contemporary in Cambridge of people like Ramanujan and C.D. Deshmukh, the first chairman of or vice chairman of Planning Commission, and of course a pioneer in the field of policy making, and study of cooperatives, agriculture economics, and a host of other things. So these are the two gentlemen that you see the portraits. And the institute, of course, is named after Gopal Krishna Gokhale, as Sanika said, who was considered as a guru by Mahatma Gandhi and also Muhammad Ali Jinnah. So we stand here, we are assembled here in a place which has very sort of a rich legacy and heritage. And I'm going to be moderating this kickoff this session with Dr. Shamika Ravi. And a warm welcome to you, ma'am. I want to introduce her, but before that, I want to tell you that this morning we were regaled, or we were fortunate, privileged to have a very free and frank discussion on a variety of things and related to public policy, on statistical matters, on academic matters. Except that one thing she said, this is going to be only between us, so it's. I can tell you some tidbits, but there's no record of it on video. So I can tell you that we have a person here who is, as I said, very frank and forthright about what she has to say. She's currently a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India, which is equivalent to the level of Secretary to Government of India. I think she's one of the youngest members of the EAC. And before that, she was Director of Research in Brookings India, a Vice President of Economic Policy at the Observer Research Foundation, and a non-resident Senior Fellow of Governance at for Brookings Institution. I know her since many years. She's had a distinguished record as an academic, as a member of a think tank, as a prolific, not just writer in the popular press, but also she's published extensively in internationally peer-reviewed academic journals. And she writes, by the way, when she writes her op-ed pieces, she writes both in English and Hindi. And, she is she's an example of what we are trying to project in this kind of a conference, which is basically building a bridge between academia and public policy. So the venue is Gokhale Institute. The event is the Pune Public Policy Festival. And we have a kickoff speaker who actually bridges these two worlds. So before I should not forget to mention that Dr. Ravi holds a PhD in economics from New York University, a Master's of Economics from Delhi School of Economics, and a Bachelor's from Lady Shri Ram College. So please welcome Dr. Shamika Ravi.
Namaskar. Good evening. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity. For me, the choice was between going to Davos or coming to Pune. And and the choice, as my revealed preference shows, is a very obvious one for someone like me. You see, a strong economy, a strong nation is our best foreign policy. is working towards as you've heard the Prime Minister repeatedly say, Vikasit Bharat. So we do have an agenda, by the way, which is by 2047, we aim to be a developed nation. It's a lofty one, we know, but aspirations are set. The topic that I have been given is catalyzing impactful governance through evidence-based policymaking. But let me first start out by saying what an excellent theme you have picked up. This is to the organizers. Not only thanks for giving me this opportunity come and meet with all of you, but trade-off, if anything, is the central theme of almost all the research that goes into policy making. You see, policy making is not a pure science. Academic research, measurements, data go so far. Beyond that, there are political compulsions. There is the whole political economy part of institutions within which we function. But as advisors, as economists, our job is to be able to measure as well as we can that what are the real costs of whatever decision we are going to make. So trade-off is the name of the game if you think of any economic policy research. Okay, it's a very, very important objective. So the way I see the job of policy advisors is basically twofold if you come from research background. One is measure the real costs. And what do I mean by real costs? As against accounting costs. So when you look at the cost of a scheme, the cost of an intervention, most often what you look at is the financing of it. Bhai, NREGA has cost us so many lakh crores, right? Maternity policy is going to cost us this much. Minimum wage is going to cost this much. So I'm talking about the economy as a whole. But we only look at accounting costs. As economists, our job is to tell your chief executive, the people who are going to make the decision, what is the economic cost of it? And what do I mean by that? That it's not just the accounting cost, there are going to be distortions. Let me highlight that. Think of NREGS, right? By now, it's been around for 20 years, right, Ajit? 20 years roundabout. We have all added to that literature which shows that NREGA has been fundamental to lowering poverty in India. It is a fantastic instrument of welfare and support that we have today. And you've seen even during the COVID time how we have deployed it. And it was a tremendous instrument to overcome this kind of a crisis. We look at the outlays and say, this is what NREGS is costing us. But you know, there is very good research, and this is where I'll tell you a very small story, to show that between 2005 and 2010, around the time when this had started getting implemented, we did a very large randomized control trial in the state of combined Andhra Pradesh, in two of the most backward districts of Medak and Mehboob-Nagar. This is across 1,200 villages. This was an RCT where the idea was that you can transform ultra-poor people into micro-entrepreneurs if you give an asset which has a cash flow. Now, this is a very compelling idea. And if you do a search called Target Ultra Poor or Graduation Program, this was a scheme that was implemented in 8 countries. There were 10 programs. This is a massive World Bank project. And we evaluated it. In fact, Jonathan Mordock from NYU, and I was at ISB then, we evaluated this over 5 years. Unlike elsewhere in the world, Honduras, Pakistan, Bangladesh, in Andhra Pradesh, we found no impact of this program. That when you gave an asset in the form of a 40,000 worth buffalo, after 4 years, no difference between people who got the asset and people who did not, which is a treatment minus control. And then, of course, as researcher, you are crestfallen, you think it's horrible, there is publication bias, all of that kicks in. But then when you really begin to dig deeper, what we discovered is this is a time when, because of NREGS, the minimum wages in rural areas had risen nearly 40% in Andhra Pradesh. So your casual labor is getting more and more income on account of NREGS. So poverty and that link makes sense, one part of the story that we do not talk about much, and we should, is that the rising rural wages also meant that thousands of micro enterprises became non-viable because your labor costs were so high that you had to shut down. You could not afford to run these enterprises because your labor costs went up. Now, when you think of the real cost of NREGS, you not only have to look at the accounting cost, which is how much it costs you, but what is the growth foregone every time we come up with a welfare or a redistribution policy, which has a certain objective of, let's say, poverty eradication. Then you allow for a proper decision making. Think of the maternity leave policy. When we think of policy, we think like rich country. We want to be progressive. The US has 0 days of paid maternity leave. We are going to have 6 months of paid maternity leave. Now, it sounds right. And of course, there is absolutely no reason why the most affluent nation in the world should have 0 paid maternity leave. But the reality of it is that as a country like India, which is under $3,000 per capita, we also have to think of how much welfare can we afford. We went from 3 months to 6 months. And some people felt very happy. But you know what happened on the ground when the evaluation started to come? Enterprises started basically substituting women for men. They were unwilling to pay 6 months of work, 1 year of salary. This is particularly true in your micro, small, medium enterprises. So you see, the job of economists like us becomes one of measuring accurately and telling the policymaker, these are your costs. Not just the accounting costs, there are distortions, and I'll keep coming back to that. I think the second job in the current time is precision policy making. What do I mean by that? Let's look at this. This is maternal mortality rate of India, and how does it compare with the global maternal mortality rate? Ours are the blue bars. Do you see how sharply it is falling compared to the global maternal mortality rate? It's an important metric because it is one of the SDGs that we are signatory to, and also we keep a very close watch on it. India is seeing a much faster decline in maternal mortality rate, right? But this is not an all-India problem. Maternal mortality rate is really concentrated on 7 states of the country. So do you realize national level policy making has now already given way to localized or more state level policy making? MMR is no longer an all India problem, it's a problem of 7 states of India. But let's go beyond that. If I look at one of the states, which is Madhya Pradesh, do you see how MMR is distributed across the districts of the state? That is Madhya Pradesh. But do you know what is the size of an average district of India? 2 million people. Our districts are so enormous that precision policy making for 2 million still sounds absurd. Therefore, we are in the realm of what we call aspirational blocks now. Do you realize that to get to that level of precision policy making, do you realize the data that is needed? The real-time, good quality feedback that an administrator requires to make a targeted intervention is acute. We really have to improve our data quality if we are to get rid of this kind of problem. This is our IMR, infant mortality rate, which is the other SDG. This is a correlation between having control for several factors. Look at the infant mortality rate across all the states of India and see what is happening with economic growth. It's GDP per capita on the x-axis. Do you see that not just 1 or 2 or some parts or some states, every state of India is seeing a crashing infant mortality rate with economic growth? There are so many compelling papers that have proven now that targeted intervention of the governments are good, they're working. But you know what is the factor that leads to the biggest decline or the biggest contributing factor? Economic growth. When you have more wealth, when there is more food, when there is clean water, when there is electricity, children survive. Therefore, economic growth remains non-negotiable for India. We are at a time when globally, and if you go to Europe particularly, you're going to have conversations about degrowth. Not for us. We have just come out of poverty. Growth for us is non-negotiable because this is what economic growth is about. But it is a very large country. And when people used to say this to me, I used to say, oh, it's because you are lazy, you don't want to look at the details, but it's a very large country. And if you start to look at each state economy, you realize that each of them has very distinct features. India should be thought of as vibrant 28 state economies and union territories with very specific features. So if you look at growth in the first 10 years of liberalization in the next 20s, which is the last 20, you see overall India has grown faster now. The first 10 years, we grew. But the real inflection point, meaning the phase from where we go to exponential growth or very rapid growth, happened post 2002 and 3. But not everywhere and not equally. In fact, the thing I want to point out is we do have a state which actually had a negative growth in the first 10 years. So governance matters. That's the state of Bihar. Second is we actually have a state which grew faster in the first 10 years, is growing slower now, West Bengal. You see, evidence-based policy making is about recognizing that each state is not growing equally. And that is where the specific precision policy is required. Now, if you think of course, the 16th Finance Commission has been announced. We are a large country and our finances have to be managed in a way that we continue to grow in a sustainable manner. But like I said, not all states are growing equally. So I'm going to show you some statistics on the trade-offs, which is the theme today. If you look at the non-development spending of states, you see state spending can be classified into development and non-development. The biggest non-development components are pensions, interest payment, and administrative expenses. This is showing interest payment, meaning how much of your state finances are actually going towards debt financing, how much of it you are paying as interest. You see, the red line is telling you at an all India level, as a percentage of development spending, see how much we were spending on interest first. First 10 years, it continued to grow. Larger and larger share of development was being spent to pay interest. And when we brought in the FRBM, policies matter. When we brought in the FRBM in 2003, you see what happened after that? Interest burden as a percentage of development expenditure started to fall, meaning now we have more money for development. That is the red line, which is an all India level. But now look at each of the states independently. Look at each state and how the finances are being managed. We do have some states where interests are eating into development funds. And they are there for you to see. Those are where the blue bars are way above the red bars. State of Kerala. You're going to say state of Punjab, state of West Bengal. These are not sustainable. Okay? Absolutely not sustainable. If you look at pensions, which is another very big category, because increasingly you are seeing states announce in the electoral politics that we will go back to old pension scheme. What is happening to pensions as a percentage of development spending? Do you see that in the first 10 years, the way it rose? Look at that red line, how sharply it is rising. Pensions started eating into development money very rapidly. And then we brought in the pension reform. Do you see after that how the red line has stabilized? Pension reform or the new pension scheme is one of the most fundamental structural reforms that India has brought about. You have some states which have much higher pension burden, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, again, West Bengal is right, Assam, Punjab. For states to want to go back to old pension scheme is the trade-off, because pensions favor 5 to 6% of the state's population. And what is the trade-off? Trade-off is reduced development expenditure, which affects 100% of the state. The trade-off is very obvious. The more you give out in form of pensions, which is non-contributory in nature, the more you're going to eat into development spending of the state, which goes into health, education, infrastructure, and 100 years of growth in the future. Okay, so the trade-offs are very clear and obvious. If you look at total capital outlay, meaning how much are the states paying for their long-term infrastructure development or capital outlay, you're seeing that the states which are growing fast are also spending tremendous amount on future growth. Right? And yet, we are now, Kerala is a very progressive state. But if you look at the capital outlay, much below the national average. If you do not invest into upkeep of infrastructure, or capital outlay includes many aspects of human development, where is long-term growth going to come from? So capital outlay is it's a good proxy for long-term growth. Okay, look at Delhi. Delhi in the center used to be a positive outlier. Delhi used to spend much more than the rest of the country on capital outlay. And then in the last 7 years, so they were a positive outlier, now they are a negative outlier. You're going to see this in the quality of growth and what is happening to infrastructure. We're already beginning to see that. The trade-off has another component, which is cross-subsidization. The feeling that if a state has money, you can spend it the way you want, which is the culture of freebie that you are discussing. It's part of our public debate. The point is that when you think like an economist, then you understand that you have the money today, you can spend it the way you want as a state. But if you don't spend it right, you're not going to have the money for very long. A classic case is the state of Punjab. That's the black line. 18 years ago, Punjab was the richest state in terms of per capita GDP. 18 years ago. All those states, Haryana, Gujarat, Karnataka, Kerala, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, everyone per capita was poorer than Punjab. Today, an average Haryanvi is 1.5 times richer than an average Punjabi. Do you see what is happening to growth? Punjab has seen in the last 20 years active deindustrialization. It is losing industry at a time when other states are competing for industry. So you have the money, but where is the future money going to come from? And industry can cross-subsidize agriculture and farming, but not beyond a point. So we have to think of where are the future jobs going to come from. So state finances and strategic thinking for jobs and future of a state is very fundamental. Trade-offs are very real. Now let us look at how is wealth distributed in India. This is real-time assets. Okay, this is not income, meaning asset ownership. House, land, motorcycle, telephone, these are real assets. Every red dot in this graph is 1,000 poor household. Every yellow dot is 1,000 middle class household. And every green dot is 1,000 rich household. Do you see, first of all, how wealth is distributed across the country and how poverty is distributed? Now, my question to you is, does India have a north-south divide? No, but it does have a divide. You can actually draw a line from Srinagar to Kanyakumari. The western part of our country is far more industrialized and affluent. The eastern part of our country is where poverty is concentrated. Again, all India's central schemes need to be very different now when you think of these states versus. So an NREGA in Bihar has to be very different from NREGA in Gujarat. A Gujarati is not going to do the same kind of unskilled work under NREGS as a Bihari is willing to do. Okay, this is evidence-based policy making. Look at our urban-rural divide. Exactly the same concept. First of all, do you see how green is urban India? You can identify your cities by looking at the green clusters. Cities are the engine of economic growth. This is going back to Ambedkar's point. But policy making in India, and largely in Delhi, we've fundamentally believed in the Gandhian philosophy that India lives in the villages. Not anymore. 65% of India is urbanized today, as per the modern data. We have to now, and you will see in the next 5 to 10 years, increasingly, policy is going to be more and more focused on urban planning. You saw the announcement of an urban planning committee in the last budget after 75 years of independence. So we are now thinking more and more urban. A little bit on labor, lots of youngsters in the room, and we do think about unemployment and worry about it. First of all, that is labor force participation. This is unemployment rate. There's a peculiarity to India's labor market. Labor force participation is of the working age population, how many people are either working or looking for work. China had over 40 years labor force participation around 75%. Vietnam has had labor force participation of around 70%. Bangladesh has labor force participation of around almost 60%. You know what is India's labor force participation rate? It's barely 50%. So, what is half our population of the working age group doing if they are neither working nor looking for work? You see, it is a peculiarity. That's number one. Number two, if you look at unemployment rates, a lot of debates remain at national level. But smart thinking, and this is where all of you interested in public policy, when you think of something at an all India level, I'm sorry, it's very lazy thinking. It's a very large country. You have to at least think state-wise. And the minute you start looking at state-wise, what do you see? The all India unemployment rate is around 6 to 7%. But do you know what is unemployment rate in Karnataka, Gujarat? It's 1.6. 0.9. Chhattisgarh, 1.9. Kerala, 12.5. You see, states which are improving ease of doing business, which are business friendly, states which are growing economically rapidly are also creating jobs. So wealth creation is leading to job creation. It's a fallacy to think that the government will create the jobs and those are the best jobs. It's a mindset and we'll have to contest it and fight it, but it'll take time. But this is the reality, that we have to become business friendly. Wealth creators are creating jobs. So we have to become friendly towards enterprises. Then there is a global phenomenon of youth unemployment. The IMF calls it youth inactivity, which is really a euphemism, a nice sounding term for the fact that the youth are not working. This is the red bars are the unemployment rate of people under 30, and the grey bars are unemployment of people over 30. So what is happening at the age of 30? So there is expectations management. Okay. If you dig this deeper, India has a peculiar phenomenon similar to China, but because China doesn't share data, we don't know much about it, but we do know about India, which is a phenomenon called graduate unemployment. Here we are looking at all young people, so people from 18 to 29, the most highly educated, so graduate and above, versus the least educated, which is primary education and below. Do you see the difference? Your most educated people in India are 5 times as likely to be unemployed as the least educated people. Now, when we were in school, we were told, study hard, you'll get a good job. But clearly the world has turned on its head. The more educated you are, the more likely you are sitting at home. So what does it mean? First, quality of education. Because industry is repeatedly telling us, in India, we don't have a constraint of capital anymore. We can raise the finances. It is skilled manpower, which is the biggest constraint. So how do these two things coexist? That you have industry looking for skills and you have youngsters looking for right job. This is the skill gap. We have lots of degrees. We don't have adequate skill. So Skill India becomes one of the most strategic and important interventions. Right? Second is managing expectations. I'm waiting for the right job because now I'm a PhD. Right? And then after I turn 30, I will apply to a clerical job in the government. This expectation management needs a changing. And that policy intervention is not limited to government. There is a role for society as a whole as well. I want to end with this story, which is Robert Schiller's. I'm extremely impressed with this because I think this is the living reality of our world. It's called narrative economics. Okay? What does narrative economics mean? That there is a perception and we are building that perception and the media has a very important role for it. In corporate finance, stories used to be planted about yourself, that you are very good, you've acquired new land, got a new license. Or you planted story about your rival, that the guys who had a heart attack, the wife has divorced him, etc., because it affected your stock price. Now, what was limited to corporate finance is now reality, even in terms of international relations, trade, etc. Why do I say this? This is called GDELT data. To those in the room, the youngsters who are interested in data, this is open source, so download it. This is all the media of the world that is on Google. So this is more than 100 languages. This is not Indian media, Chinese media, US, this is all media. So New Zealand media, Ecuadorian media, all media. And there is something called tone, that Is it covering positively or negatively? How positive? How negative? And this is a study that starts in the beginning, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Do you see all countries, China, Sweden, India, US, Germany, everyone is getting negative coverage. And that is normal because that is the job of media, to talk about problems in society. Right? Except what happened within 6 months of COVID outbreak? Do you see that the democracies of the world continue with negative coverage, except what has happened to global media coverage of China? Do you see there is systematic something unfolding here? Narratives are managed. And you're getting more and more evidence of this coming, how media gets managed. You are going to see reports. Your institutions, as you grow economically and in stature, will come under attack. All right? We have to understand these trends. By the way, I'm just skimming the data. A lot more can be done. We know exactly where the news is coming from. For every media house, we can tell you how do they cover a particular issue. So data is very powerful today. All right? And I will end with something closer to home, which is India is getting majoritarian. Well, there is politics. So let's leave the politics to the politicians. What does the data say? Well, if you look at administrative data, which is, and I'm only showing you for electricity, but we have a EAC paper which looks at 6 different amenities: LPG, water, mobile telephony, bank accounts, toilets, and this is electricity. What has happened to access to electricity across the poorest 20% of households in the country? And this is not government data. Because of course the government says 100% electrification. We trust survey. That is why surveys are important. There are problems with survey, that's a secondary. We have to improve the quality. But what are people reporting? Well, people are telling you this, that all India, amongst the poorest segment of the society, in the last 7-8 years, the poorest half of them had electricity. Today that number is up to 86%. In fact, the most recent numbers we are hearing is it has crossed 90. If you look at religious breakup, what do you see? Muslim households, 50% had it amongst the poorest. Today it is 86. Hindu households, 52 to 85. Do you see a discrimination in administration? Do you see a discrimination across social categories, which is general class, OBC, SC, ST? So there is politics, there is narrative, and then there is administration and actual data. And this is what evidence-based policy making is about. So I encourage you, especially the youngsters, once again, open source data, play with it. Okay, this is a time for you to do the research and translate it for people, especially within the Gokhale Institute, etc. So thank you very much. Everything that I presented is actually part of much more terse and academic paper, but I've just shown you the basic results, hopefully showing you the very close connection between data, evidence, and policy making. Right? Thank you very much. Namaskar.
So, Shamika has talked about evidence-based policy making. One evidence that I noticed is that many of the slides had the first chart was always Gujarat. But let's leave that evidence aside. So one question I wanted to ask you is, this is Gokhale Institute, Baba. So it's not Delhi. See, this one, so we have, just rapid fire, Shamika. This, you mentioned a very, very important evidence, which is that, as you said, in India, only 10% of the people in the workforce have an organized sector. They have a job with some pension benefits and so on. Only less than 10%. And the evidence shows that only 3% of the workforce, that is population, is consuming something like 27% of pensions and salaries budgets of governments. These are government workers, military, and so on. This is evidence which is so stark. Then why is it not translating into policy making? I mean, this is, why are the 97% of the people not, why are they so silent and just suffering? And there's a report by the Andhra Pradesh government, official report, which says that if this thing continues like this, and you mentioned OPS, the demand to bring back OPS, then by 2030, almost the entire government budget will be used up for just salaries and pensions of these organized workers and retirees. So how
No,
do you?
it's a very good point, Ajit. So first of all, it might seem like madness, but there's always a method to data. The reason Gujarat is on the top because those states are rank ordered by highest real growth in the last 20 years. That is the
That
rank.
was in a lighter vein, Baba.
Everything in data has a very obvious explanation. I'll tell you, pension, and this is a question, Ajit, as economists, we have to accept the fact that look, better coordinated, whatever the size of that minority which benefits. Why is it that electoral politics is leading to parties announcing we will come back to old pension and that getting votes because you have a small minority which is very well coordinated.
But
And a lot of politics is about well coordinated and well organized, vociferous
that's
population.
so that's the point I want to ask. That the small minority of people are benefiting at the expense of the large silent majority. They are so vociferous and can influence policy making. So is there not a role for public intellectual, like I mean, public researchers to point this out?
Well, I think as a democracy and as a robust functional democracy, we have to accept first of all that this is one of the negatives. This is one of those constraints in democracy that if a well coordinated, well organized minority can sway these kind of regressive policy, what do you do about it? Well, the solution has to be in the form of an institutional reaction, which is, development of a common minimum program. Right? This is where the finance commissions, this is why you got FRBM, by the way. The first 10 years, you saw what happened to pension payment? It escalated. It from 5 to some 30 whatever percent, it escalated and you brought in the right rule, which was FRBM. You tied the hands of states and center, meaning governments, number one. Number two, you brought in the new pension scheme. After all, the whole idea of building institutions and coming up with rules is so that collectively we don't have this problem, which is just because you're well organized and loud.
Yeah. So the other example I want to bring up, by the way, on this, that was a very good graph where you showed this thing coming down, interest payment. But remember, it is also Mr. Jaswant Singh and his debt swap program. He swapped all the high cost debt of the states, and the center took on this debt swap. The other thing was about where you mentioned this maternity benefit. So in its great sort of moment of enlightenment and inspiration, the government passed a law saying that maternity benefits should be extended to 26 weeks, I think. 26 weeks, thinking that this is going to protect and help women's participation and returning to the workforce. But the evidence, as you said, is actually women's employment went down in the organized sector. This is a reaction of potential employers who are doing so. How does one deal with this? This is an evidence, or you'll change the policy again, or did we not make enough calculations? Did not anticipate?
There is always a fear. Remember that while we are talking about evidence-based policy making, you also have to be very careful that there can be policy-based evidence making as well, and that is something we really have to warn against, and that's why you have to be scrutinizing, and data really is as objective as it can get. Now, what you're going to witness over the next several years, Ajay, as per at least the revealed preference of the announcements that we have seen at the highest office, is women's labor force participation is a problem in India. Not because it is falling, but because it is not rising fast enough. It is still very low. When the international institutions come and tell us that, oh, you need to raise women's labor force participation, I often ask them, well, show me the switch and we'll turn it on. You see, these kind of outcomes in society, these are not mechanical. This is one problem microeconomists also have with these macro guys who treat that the economy is a formula. So raise maternity and something will happen. No. The reason women's labor force participation is not rising the level as it should is we have a rapidly urbanizing economy. We have a rapidly nuclearizing family setup. You don't have grandparents and uncles and aunts, etc. But we are still very traditional because we want children. We have still not graduated to being dog parent and cat parents. So if you want children, and children are very labor intensive, I have 2 sons. Who is going to raise those kids? And by the way, COVID has been a wake-up call. For the first time in history, you have seen such large number of elderly people die alone without family. So there is, and this is the great Angus Deaton and Deaths of Despair when he says, family is breaking down.
Yeah.
So we have to, therefore, again, it's a trade-off. We want the women to come into the labor force, but we also want the family.
So I think this is I must compliment on one thing. This is a very complex phenomenon. The low labor force participation of women in India is very complex because I want to add to what she said. There are cultural factors, there are social factors, there are economic factors, and many things are interplaying at the same time. But I do want to compliment and acknowledge that actually the government is very, sort of solidly seized of this. And we do acknowledge that our labor force participation is low and it needs to go up. I want to come back to your last slide. You said narratives matter, right? But why doesn't truth matter? How is it that narratives matter and the truth doesn't matter? Let me just illustrate what I'm saying. The same data is used by the World Bank and the IMF. I'm not even going into those other partisan, Mr. Sujit Bhalla's or Mr. John Drez, the famous debates of Indian Express. But let's take World Bank and IMF. Their poverty estimates of Indian data using, I think, same data set, same. So there 10% difference. So is this narrative or is it wrong mathematics, wrong economics?
I think, when you get into, and there is a reason I don't jump into that debate, is...
So just a headline understanding of why such a
headline
big divergence.
And it's a very philosophical question that you've asked, Ajay, that does truth matter? My point will be, look, data is a means to the truth. If you think data gives you truth or anything gives you truth, then I'm sorry, we have a very naive understanding of the world. The point is, as against an anecdote where you say everything is going to dogs, or someone says everything is wonderful, the reality is somewhere in between, and data is the only relatively more objective way to address that problem. So between Drez and Bhalla, I'll tell you, even if you look at databases, different data sets are meant for different purposes. We are also force-fitting many things. So whether it is the multidimensional index debate, whether it is the minute you get into what is the purpose of the data and what is the sampling and what are the weights, and those are all extremely non-fun things I can see from. But that is where I think some element of truth lies there.
So therefore we must be, when you said evidence-based policy making, we must be concerned about the evidence itself and ask the question, is it true or how true is it, how reliable is it? But I want to quickly jump to one, maybe the last point is that, Shamika is both a public intellectual because she believes in writing in op-eds in both Hindi and English all over the country, but she's also published very scholarly and refereed journals in, scholarly articles. But she also, she's a public intellectual, but she's also a public official. So when I tried to pull her leg by mentioning Gujarat, but basically she's a public official. So people are going to interpret what she says as the voice of the government, whether she likes it or not. So how do you balance, and she's a rare person who is very frank in these interactions, and thank you for that. How do you balance, do you see a trade-off, because we are talking about evidence-based, so we need to agree about evidence. Some evidence is not exactly pleasant sometimes, not the way the government wants it to go. The trade-off between being a public official and a public intellectual, because in some time ago you told me that public intellectuals have a duty to express themselves, but how do you balance these two?
I think my job is relatively easy, Ajit. I shouldn't pretend I'm doing a very difficult job because it is research. And the reason both what I write in public as well as, while I can't discuss 90% of what I write internally, but the fundamental is research. And a lot of what we also circulate internally eventually comes out in the public domain because it is also meant to spark public discussions around certain things. So when it is research with all its caveats, then internal, external, I don't think they matter very much. But of course, if you are part of monetary policy making, everything you say, if you sneeze, someone catches cold, no. We have the luxury of actually doing data work and socializing the idea.
As an intellectual to express, say, dissent or disagreement, I'm sure it's not easy to do that, right? I mean,
I'll tell you, there is a perception that you can't disagree. In fact, I think, come to think of it, almost every note that I have written is about problems.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we'd be jobless. If everything were hunky-dory, then what are we doing in the system? So almost everything that I write about or I mention even to my boss, it is about problems that need addressing, and not always do we have the right solutions, remember.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I should mention that she mentioned Kala Handi. That's a great example of how somebody like her had to point out that the course of last 30 years, what a difference it had made. And the repeated reference to the labor force participation of women. These are just two examples among many where Shamika has written. There's one evidence-based policy making I'm going to do. The evidence I'm looking at is that the watch says 5:10 almost. So the policy I'm going to institute is that we'll have to close this to a close. So please thank Dr. Shamika Ravi
Thank you very
profusely.
much.
Thank you.